As you can see from the title slide, this is a model where PRIMED is an acronym for what I'm calling 6 design principles of evidence-based practices. And just so you have a clear sense of how we landed on this thing, for a good 20 years now, Mindy Beer and I have been trying to collect all the research on actual empirical research on effective character ed practice. School-based, we didn't look at the after-school work. There's a lot of great work on that too. We looked at school-based K-12 work on character ed. And over time, I started to cluster them into these 6 cubby holes, if you will, of 6 design principles of evidence-based practices. And you'll see why it's become a lot bigger than I ever thought it would be. It's become really useful to a lot of people and in some very surprising ways as well. So that's where all this stuff comes from. And, you know, my argument, which is not surprising, Tom's as well, and a lot of other people on this webinar conference that we're calling it, have already understood that this has to be a priority, that we need to focus on character ed. You know, and I give 3 big reasons for this. One is that it's unavoidable. You can't be an educator, you can't even be an adult around kids without impacting their character. So to play this game of, do I want to do character ed? Don't I want to do it? You know, as Tom said, one high school teacher didn't even understand that he was doing it. Said, I teach chemistry or whatever the subject was, when in fact, he was doing good character education. There are a lot of people out there who don't think they're doing it. And what they're doing is bad character education or harmful character education. So the real key is it's not a choice whether to do it or not. The key is whether to do it deliberately and well and effectively, which has been our mission all along. The second one is this notion of tikkun olam, an Old Testament notion about healing the world. And it's that, as Heraclitus said, character is destiny. The character of people is the destiny of the world. So as educators, we're not just changing kids, we're changing the world. And that's what this is about. How can we contribute through our expertise, which is educating children, to making a better world? And the last part is that it's not a trade-off between academics and character, because as Tom alluded to, good character education is good education. It actually does improve academics, and there's plenty of data to show that. And I always like Teddy Roosevelt's quote, which you've probably heard ad nauseum now: to educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society. We start focusing too much on the head of academics as opposed to head, heart, and hand of character, too much on performance character and not on moral character. We're dangerous, and we're not going to make a better world. We're going to make a worse world. And we really have to understand that balance. So what is character? Very quickly, I still haven't figured out how to depict this well enough, but this is the David Shields 4 domains that Jody alluded to before, that the Jubilee Center has adopted, unfortunately without giving him credit for it. You know, and if you two top and bottom halves of the circle, from my point of view, are moral and performance character. While they complement each other, they're conceptually separate. The moral one is about doing good in the world, and performance is about being effective in the world. And you can be good without being effective. You can be effective without being good. And then the intellectual and civic are the two kind of half ellipse type things. I'm not sure what shape that is. Coming in from the right and the left. And they tend to overlap. They overlap moral and performance. So you can do, there are moral aspects of being intellectually virtuous, and there are performance aspects of it. And there are moral aspects of being civically virtuous, and there are just performance aspects of it. And in the middle is where intellectual, civic, and moral combine on the top half, and performance, intellectual, civic combine on the bottom half. Don't worry about trying to process all this now. I just want you to understand there's a complex relationship between these 4 different areas of character. And then this is the character.org, which I need to still have it updated. The bottom there, What was called the Character-Ed Partnership is now named by their URL, character.org. Most of you knew that. And this is a notion they got from Tom, who got it from Kevin Ryan, who we found it back in Pestalozzi. We think it's probably an Aristotle. This is age-old wisdom. And good character consists of understanding, caring about, and acting upon core ethical values. And Tom just did a great job of showing how this pervades the 11 principles. So I'm not going to do any more with it than to remind you once again that if you want to do effective character education, you got to focus on all three of these pieces. None of them alone, or no two of them alone, is enough. So what is character education? Well, I have a slightly different way of talking about it, and for me, it's a way of being. So far you've heard Old Testament, you've heard classic Greek wisdom, now we're getting into Buddhism. It should give you a sense that this notion of helping the next generation be good people who can help make a better world in the long run. And thanks to Anna for pointing out this notion of the long run, which I'll get back to later. Cuts across cultures, cuts across millennia. This is just age-old global wisdom. Character education is more a matter of who you are than what you do. It's not that it's not both of them, but fundamentally it gets down to the change in the educator, him or herself. And that becomes critically important whether you're dealing with a prospective kindergarten teacher, a future leader, a current principal, a current superintendent, whoever you're talking about. They have to look in the mirror. And that's something I learned from Tom a long time ago. And we'll come back to that. And for a lot of educators, it's a new way of being. This is the definition I've been using in a forthcoming book that I've got on the PRIME model, that character education is nurturing the flourishing of human goodness. And in that quote, you can see my bias, because my bias is on both development and morality. And that's my background. So while I recognize all those four domains of character, I'm with Teddy Roosevelt, that if we don't focus on the moral, we're going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble. I always see that as a priority. And different people in the field differ in that. Tom and I have debated this back and forth for probably 20 or more years. So this is the PRIMED model, and that's really what I'm going to present in this talk. And I just, there, looking for where there's a clock, because the clock's disappeared on my computer screens because it's got this stuff up there. The 6 different design principles that PRIMED represents are listed here. And I'm going to go through them quickly, one at a time. They are making character ed a priority, that's the P. Focusing on relationships, that's the R. Building intrinsic motivation, Tom did some nice work on that for already today, as the I. Modeling, which he also talked about, is the M. Empowerment was a sort of a sub-theme, a more subtle sub-theme in some of the stuff that he talked about, the 11 principles, that's the E. And the D, go back to what Anna said at the beginning, that we have to grow over a lifetime and not in an instant. It's the long game. That loads very nicely on the D, or developmental perspective here. And I'll give you a sense, in a way, this is taking on a life of its own, much more so than I anticipated. At the end of 2018, there was a report that came out from the U.S. Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Attorney General's Office, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, under the auspices of the Office of the President of the United States. Started in the Obama administration, got finished up in the Trump administration, so we can say it's fully bipartisan. And what it did in this report on school safety was a couple of interesting moves. Starts off by saying, if we want to think about safe schools, first we have to think about prevention of violence before we ever talk about intervention with violence. And this is something we're also doing down in Colombia, Bogota, Colombia, but across the country. We're just piggybacking on what others are doing there. which is to say they've had over half a century of violence. They want peace in their country, and they're looking at social emotional learning and character education and so on as ways to use schools to promote peacefulness, as opposed to simply to stop violence. I gave a talk many years ago that was on C-SPAN, I believe, called Anti-Violence. Because I think that when we just target how do we reduce the violence, we're setting the bar way too low. We want to promote peacefulness, caring, and compassion in schools, and not simply stop the bullying stuff. Oh no, it was anti-bullying. I'm sorry. That was the title, anti-bullying. Because I got tired of all the anti-bullying programs which highlight the misbehavior. What I wanted to promote was the good behavior of peacefulness and reconciliation and conflict mediation and all the kinds of things that we should have as the way we interact with each other all the time in a positive pro-social way, than simply say getting rid of bullying makes this a great school. Nah, it just is a school that doesn't have one problem, is all it is. That was the first thing they did, is say we have to look at prevention. The other amazing thing they did is they said the best way to do prevention is character education, which in the US, in recent history, that's unusual, because probably right around the end of the George W. Bush administration and when the Obama administration came in, the word character kind of disappeared from the scene for a lot of reasons I'm not going to bother going into now. So to see it resurrected here in this report was great to see. And then for us, what was nice, at the end of this section, they listed 5 national prevention recommendations. These are 5 things that are evidence-based as effective. And PRIMED was one of them. And PRIMED was really not known at that point. There was one presentation that we did at the National Academies of Science, and there was one rather esoteric article in a journal. But somebody caught wind of it, said this is something we need, and so we're happy it's in there. So let me go through these with you in the next loosely half hour and give you a sense of how these things are foundational design principles that you can use to build classrooms, schools, districts. And we even have people now looking at how to use these in corporations, sports leagues, teams, endeavors. And some people are using it for their morning meditation about the way they live their lives. That every morning they get up and they sit and they think about how can I be more of these 6 things in the way I do my work, in the way I function. So the first one, the P, is prioritization. Okay. And this is not going to be a big surprise for you, for me, for Tom, but character development must be, if not the primary goal of the school, then at least one of the top goals of the school. Now, for me, it should be the primary goal of the school. And it's interesting when you look across the history of education, at least in the US, but not only in the US, it's really over the last half century or so that we lost this. Historically, this has always been there. Go all the way back to our founding fathers and so on, as they talked about the need for an educated population to be able to participate in the self-governing experiment that is the United States, and in lots of other ways. And I'm not going to go through the history of how it kind of withered on the vine, but you can think about the Back to Basics movement spurred on by, the space race. You can think about the No Child Left Behind focus that really focused people on the high stakes tests, which were not in character, and a number of other things that all led to academics becoming the priority, top priority, and character moving away from that a bit. And I got to give my nod to Tom, because Tom saw this way before I and others saw this, and sort of kept the flame of character education going in lots of different ways, even during the dark years where it was not a term to be used, it was not a focus to highlight and to attach yourself personally and politically to, but he kept it going all those years, along with people like Kevin Ryan and others. So hats off to them. And when we think about it being a priority, it must be an authentic priority. It can't be lip service. It can't be quickly overthrown by 3 or 4 or 5 other things that really become more important. The budget's more important. Academics is more important. Public perception and the media, local media is more important. What parents scream about is more important. The teachers union is more important than you can go on with a long list of things that might suddenly bump it from the agenda. The best leaders of schools and districts that I know who have succeeded at this have said, this is what will drive our train. This is what will take us to the promised land. This is what fulfills our purpose. This is why we're here. And we will not deter from that. That's an authentic priority. Sometimes you'll see leaders claim it's an authentic priority. And my colleague, Amy Johnston, who many of you have heard or met, my former doc student, my protege, and now my colleague, often, she found this somewhere. I don't know where she found it. She said, if you want to know what somebody's priority is, look at their daily calendar and their credit card statements, and you'll know what their priorities are. In other words, look where they put their time and their money. And very often in schools, it's not part of the calendar, and there's no budget line for this. Other things get priority when we allocate these resources of time and money. So how authentically do you actually allocate time and money to this? I don't want to spend a lot more time on that. So let me move forward and point out that leadership is key. And I'm highlighting this because of the group that's convened here today and tomorrow. We need leaders who get it. If they don't really deeply understand what we're talking about here, not just what it is, but why it's so critical, what its role is in education, how important they are and their leverage to making this happen, if they don't really get that, then you're not going to go very far. And then they have to know how to do it. They have to be the instructional leader of character ed, if you will. One of my favorite principals of all time, an elementary school principal, Karen Smith, was just a master at this. Just so you get a sense of Karen. Karen was an educator for 41 years, and she kept threatening to retire, over and over again. I kept talking her off the ledge because I didn't want her ever to leave a school. And then she finally sent me an email one day saying, Marvin, I just submitted my notice of retirement. And I wrote her back a one-word email which just said, quitter. Because even at 41 years, I didn't want her to stop. But she was one who was truly an instructional leader of character ed. If her teachers were struggling with how to do a buddying activity, class meeting, how to teach kids how to do conflict mediation, how to integrate character ed into a lesson, whatever it was, she could go into their classroom and do a demo. She could demonstrate a lesson. She could do it for her faculty. She not only understood why it was basically the core of what she had to do and be to make this work, but she could do it and demonstrate it. You don't find many people like that. She was just really remarkable. We need to invest in the professional development of leaders. I don't need to say that to this group. And we must shine their lights on the adult culture part. Tom said this, for principle 4, we have to look at the adults first. And I love the phrase that you used, Tom, we can't give what we haven't got. I've never heard you say that before, and that's a nice way of doing it. I'm going to talk in a little bit about how we're doing that. In fact, I'll turn to some of that right now to give you, because some people said they wanted models for this. when Hope was first, and particularly Kara, because she really designed the Principal of Leadership Academy. When she was designing this, she came to us to learn about our Leadership Academy and character education. And she'd really, to her credit, she'd intuited a lot of this stuff already and had some of it in place. So the Hope Leadership Academy looks a little different. But it shares a lot of features with ours. We've been doing this for over 20 years now. I keep saying 20 years. I realize a couple of years have gone by, so it's more than 20 years now. And that's a year-long program like the Hope Leadership Academy. It has some different features to it, which I'm not going to go into now. We also have a VLACE, which was commissioned by the HTC Education Foundation in Taiwan, because they wanted to replicate LACE in Taiwan. There was no way we could transport this to Taiwan, because it's a face-to-face thing. Tom comes in, does a day, I do a day, others come in, do a day. We couldn't do that. So we created a video-based blended learning version of it, which could be used in the US or elsewhere. Civil is Mindy Beer's work. She's the co-director of our center. And this is important work for us now. LACE, the Leadership Academy, always had two goals. One goal was to equip current and future leaders with what they needed to lead a school of character. Equip them with the knowledge, the skills, the methods, and so on. But the second one was to transform them to be the kind of person who's best positioned to lead a school like that. Because not every leader is the kind of person and the kind of leader who can pull this off. We didn't do very well with the latter one. And then Mindy came up with this notion of civil, which is about the virtues of servant leadership. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. And she did a mini project on that to develop it. And then we created SEAL, the last of these, which integrates civil LACE and adds a mentoring piece thanks to the Kern Family Foundation. The idea is Templeton funded the servant leadership work, and Kern has now funded us to actually implement the integration of servant leadership with a post-leadership academy mentoring element. So they get a year of leadership academy infused with the virtues of servant leadership to better focus on them working on their own character as a leader. And then when they're done, they get a year or two of mentoring by some phenomenal retired National School of Character leaders. We've been doing this so long in St. Louis that Alabama has a few National Schools of Character. I've lost track. We probably have 50 or something like that in the St. Louis region, because we've been doing this for so long. And I should do a shout out to Character Plus, which is a local professional development organization for character that's been around. And between Character Plus and our center and the Leadership Academy, that's why there's so much of it. So this is something I need to tell you about for each of these 6. What we did is we looked at our research on effective practices and then align them underneath each of these design principles. So this is just an example. We sent you in advance the article that I alluded to before that really goes a little deeper into PRIMED and gives you all of the strategies for each of the 6 design principles. And I'm not going to spend much time on these because we don't have the time to do that now, but I always want to give you a glimpse of the fact that there are specific implementation strategies aligned with each of these design principles. We don't think it's an exhaustive list. It's just a list that we found in the research literature. There are probably many, many more out there that are effective ones that nobody's tested or we haven't seen research on yet. So we didn't include them, but it doesn't preclude them being used by people. So one of them is rhetorical emphasis, and that's having this language, common shared language of goals and values that you saw in the 11 principles with Tom. Second one I just mentioned, allocation of resources, time and money, for instance. Building an intentional school and classroom climate around character makes it a priority, and you heard some of that in the 11 principles. Having school-wide structures. So it's not just a teacher implementing X in the classroom. That's the problem with some things like Second Step, which are good programs with research that show they work. Great Expectations, another one, which have historically been classroom level, teacher delivered, not school wide, ignoring leadership very often. We want that too. And then leadership I already talked about. So that's all I'm going to say about the prioritization one. Relationships is the R. And the way I like to say this is that educators come to education because they have golden hearts for children. They love kids and they want the best for kids. And they want to be an agent in helping kids flourish. And I have no doubt about that. Certainly there are some rare exceptions for people coming for other reasons, but that's by and large why people come to education. And they therefore have a firm belief that because we as educators love kids and want what's best for them, healthy relationships are going to develop in my classroom, in my school, in my district. And they're right, except for the kids and adults who need it most. They are going to fall through the cracks. They are not going to get these relationships unless we're strategic and intentional and structural about focusing on relationships. So Tom mentioned, when he was doing the Smart and Good High School study, seeing advisories in some way, shape, or form in a lot of the schools, if not all the schools. You see it in a lot of middle schools, a lot of high schools, this advisory structure. But he also noted that in some schools it was 1 day a week, some it's every day, some it's some other variation. Some schools, they do advisories in ways that become study halls and they don't really have anything to do with character, but they think because they're doing advisories, somehow it's a checkoff. Doing advisories in a structural and intentional way that's relationship building is different than just having advisories. So one thing I love, and we got this from Halifax Middle School originally, which gave us the idea of doing it at Amy Johnson School, Francis Hill Middle School and other schools, is to multi-age your advisories in a middle or high school. So you have a mixture of grades at every one. It gives you the opportunity to loop them. So it's not, so it's not just the teacher stays with a group of kids for the 3 or 4 years in the school, but there are kids in there from different grades that stay together for 2 or 3 years, which builds all kinds of different relationships than you normally wouldn't get. And if you do it every day, you're more likely to build relationships. And if the content of what you're doing at advisory focuses on character and relationship building intentionally, then you're more likely to build relationships and so on. I can't go through a whole lot of examples of this because we don't have the time, but that's a critical piece. To do it intentionally, strategically, structurally, and to remember that everybody matters. So Tom talked about bus drivers, he talked about others. The non-teaching staff, the non-certified, non-professional staff, whatever language you use for it in your schools, often get lost. They're not on the radar for this. I'll give you one thing that we came up with, which we thought was a nod to this, which is that every classroom in an elementary, every advisory in a middle or high school adopts an adult in the building who doesn't lead a class or an advisory. Could be the principal, could be the principal's secretary, could be the cook, could be the counselor, could be whoever doesn't have them. And they become an honorary member of your class or advisory. You get to know them, you celebrate their birthday, you invite them to special events, and suddenly you have a strategic, structural way of kids building relationships with people they wouldn't have had a relationship with before. I mean, Tom talked about the custodian who wanted to go into every class and say, hey, I'm so-and-so and I do this. Well, in this model, this custodian had a class that he or she was connected with. So that's a way of, an example of a way to think outside the box and start building relationships that often don't get built. I just want to remind people that some kids in the school are struggling so mightily because they don't have healthy relationships in their family that having a teacher or another adult in the building, whether it's the custodian or the secretary or anybody, can not only change the trajectory of the kid's life, based on research, it can literally lengthen their lives. It can literally preempt premature death from violence, drug use, criminality, risk-taking, poor health care, and so on. So it's really important that we look for these kids who are so off-putting that often we think this really isn't the kind of kid I want to have a relationship with, and realize those are the kids who most need us. School climate is a critical piece of relationships. We need to build this relational climate. Go back to what Anna said at the beginning to frame this, about how it is being other-centered and having a school with a climate that's other-centered. But probably the most frightening and most important and underused piece of all of this is the adult culture. And every leader's most important job is building a healthy adult culture. Because the adults teach the kids. Principal doesn't have to teach the kids. Superintendent doesn't have to run the schools. They've got to build the adult culture so that those people are best positioned to do what's in kids' best interests. And then there are a bunch of relationship strategies. One I like to focus on are these peer interactive pedagogies. Tom mentioned them before, whether it's cooperative learning or reading circles or group project-based learning or whatever it is, where kids have to work with other kids to do their academic work. Because one of the things we often forget when we think about integrating character into the core curriculum is that it's not just content, it's also methodology. It's methods. And using these peer interactive methods is a way to do relationships. The I, Tom talked about it nicely. This is the internalization, the intrinsic motivation piece of this. Ultimately, if we think about what our goal is to change who these kids are, to change them inside. If the words are on the wall, and if they can regurgitate them for you and use them in a sentence and write a persuasive essay about them, but it never goes inside who they are. It doesn't affect their motives, their values, their emotions, then you failed. It doesn't matter. Okay, if all you talked to was the head and you never got to the heart, and the head, heart, and hand, then it doesn't matter. Which means, you know, and I take a much stronger stance than Tom, although we tend to be aligned, stay away from the extrinsic motivation. It's just not helpful. In many ways, it undermines you. And that's a tough sell for a lot of educators. I'm not going to go through DC and Ryan again, autonomy, belonging, and competence, because Tom talked about it. And these are some of the strategies using developmental discipline. If people haven't read Marilyn Watson's book, Learning to Trust, I highly recommend it. It's a remarkable book. Focusing on self-growth, making your character a self-project. And I will tell you, for those of you, which is, I guess, most of you, who are working with school leaders and want to change who they are, what we do with the servant leadership work is we make it a self-project. They are constantly self-evaluating, doing goal setting, strategic planning, monitoring, prioritizing these characteristics in themselves. You know, and we're hearing some amazing stuff from them about, you know, forgiveness and gratitude and how they need to increase these things to be more effective as school leaders. It's really, really powerful stuff. And the service part, Tom talked about that. Modeling is the M. And basically, you know, I said you can't demand from students what you will not do yourself. Tom said you can't give what you haven't got. Studying exemplars is really nice. I agree. And in fact, it's on my next slide. And this is Tom from a long time ago. We said the single most powerful tool you have for influencing a child's character is your character. You know, or Gandhi said you must be the change you want to see in the world. And I'd like to say you must be the character you want to see in your students. And unless we get teachers to look in the mirror, self-assess, work to set goals, try to improve, to be a better person, unless we get school leaders who make this part of the adult culture, that it's okay to stumble as long as you accept it or try to do better. It's okay as peers amongst the adult world to give each other constructive critical feedback about your character. In Amy Johnson's school, you probably heard it from her. If not, you may have heard it from me before. The teachers themselves came up with this notion of their character crown, that they're being held to a high standard. They're supposed to walk around with a character crown and be emperors and empresses of character. And so they would often talk about your character crown is slipping, my character crown is around my waist, my character crown is dented. You know, they would talk, and they talk to each other about this. It became part of the adult culture. So being a role model, being a mentor, studying exemplars, there's some good curricular exemplars. A quick gift, which I do when I come down there and talk, is that the Giraffe Project, giraffe.org, www.giraffe.org, is now online for free because the people who created it, Ann Medlock and John Graham, are getting older. There's no heir apparent. They're trying to make sure it stays alive. It's a great program. The E is for empowerment. Okay. Now, I should tell you, I have a particular bias about this one. I think I first met Tom 30 some odd years ago when I was doing my postdoctoral work with Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard's Grad School of Education. I was working in what were called the just community schools, which were radical experiments in high school democracy. Smaller schools within schools. So I cut my teeth, in a sense, in some pretty radical empowerment. So when I try to argue for empowerment in schools, to me, it pales in comparison to the stuff I started with. You know, but to others, this is very daunting. This goes back to Dewey. It goes back to a lot of important roots. But the idea is that schools are preparation for democratic citizenship. Schools are supposed to feed autonomy in DC and Ryan's ABCs and self-determination theory. Schools are supposed to show respect for personhood, and what better way to show respect for one than to empower their voices, to authentically invite their voices, to listen to their voices. And we're talking about all stakeholders. You can see the long list there. So everybody's voice should matter. It should be a philosophy of empowerment at the heart of the school. And that flies in the face of the way we tend to do education, which tends to be very hierarchical. This is from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the martyrs and moral heroes of World War II, Lutheran minister, a theologian, spoke out against the Nazis. But he said the first service that one owes to others in community consists in listening to them. So we have to make space for voice. We have to be invitational of voice. We have to listen to voice, and it has to be everybody's voice. And these are a couple examples: sharing leadership and running democratic classrooms. And then lastly, in my last 3 minutes, yeah, I'm on the right time, right? Is the D, developmental pedagogy. Okay, and again, I harken back to Anne, who foreshadowed this by saying you have to grow over a lifetime, not in an instant. We as educators see kids for a brief moment in their life course. They pass through our way. Maybe at max we see them for a few years in the school, sometimes just for the 1 year we teach them in a classroom, sometimes, you know, the 1 year they happen to be in our school, or 2 years. And what I'm asking people to do is step back and say, the person you see now is a product of all that went before in their life. And what you're doing with them now is going to create ripples for the rest of their life course. And to see this as you having a place in this long trajectory, and then to design your pedagogy around that notion, not to do things just to change the here and now, but to do things that contribute to the long run, the long game. And I will end this with, well, this will be the last story. This was from the Child Development Project. Tom alluded to this before. That when they did the Child Development Project, they found just an amazing amount of positive outcomes at the end of the elementary school curriculum. But what they didn't find is an increase in academic scores. They didn't lose anything. They got all this other great stuff around character and schooling and didn't have any drop at all in academics. They held that. But when Vic Batistich came back and studied kids 3 years later, when they hadn't had any character ed for 3 years and were in middle schools that, mixed kids from schools that had this previously and kids who didn't, they found a time release effect on academics. It started showing up in 8th grade, even though it didn't show up in 5th grade. And those kids start to pull away. You just don't know down the road where your impact's going to be, where it's going to take root and make a difference in a child's life. And these are, just to say, there's a tension between development and learning. Sometimes we focus so much on learning the thing now and forget about development. And these are some strategies, which I don't have time to do right now. But I want you to think about this during your lunch break and during the next session. This quote from Paul Houston, used to be the head of AASA. Schools are perfectly designed for the results we're getting. If we don't like the results, we need to redesign schools. What do you need to redesign about your schools and programs? Thank you.